Right. It is great to see everyone here this morning, and I just want to say welcome to Second Baptist Church. We're glad that you are here with us today. We're finishing up our series on invitation today, God's invitation to us to a lot of different things. We could spend really all year long talking about all the different invitations that God has for us, but we're going to finish up with this one this morning. But I want to ask you a question before we get started. Does anybody know, and if you're a psychology major, then you probably know what this is, but does anybody know what the bystander effect is? I was thinking about this passage this morning. It just kind of came into my mind, and you'll get it when I talk about it in a second. But the bystander effect, basically, it says this, that the more people that are there watching you have an emergency in your life, the less of a chance of you getting any help from anyone. Now, that doesn't make any sense to us at all. If we're in an emergency situation and we're having some really bad things happen to us, we would think that if there were a lot of people standing around watching us see this, that there would be more of a chance for somebody to step in and help us. But that's not what the bystander effect says. When people have kind of studied human behavior, the psychologists that are out there, what they found is this inverse relationship between the number of people who are there present at a time where there's some sort of an emergency and the amount of people who actually help someone. So if there's a lot of people, less chance you're going to get any help. If there's very few people or one person and you're having an emergency, more chance you get help. Now, again, that doesn't make sense to us intuitively. That's just backwards, but that's what happens in life, and that's what happens where we see things kind of going on in our country. Now, here's some words that they use to describe why that effect happens. And the first word is this. It's called ambiguity. Now, that's a psychological term, of course, and you'll understand what that means when I tell you what happens. Because we've all felt it, we've all experienced it before, but there's sometimes when people are having an emergency that we're really not sure if they are or they're not. So you've seen people just kind of roughhouse and play, and they're kind of pushing and shoving and they're getting loud and you're like, is that a fight or is that not a fight? I'm really not sure if it is a fight or if it's not a fight. If it is, I should probably say something because it's just kind of a little bit inappropriate right now, but you're just really not sure, and so we don't do anything because there's ambiguity there. You're really not sure if there's a problem. You see somebody out in the water and they're splashing and hollering and screaming, and you're thinking, are they drowning or are they playing? Because nobody wants to run out there, dive off the dock, be the hero, and then come up out of the water and everybody's laughing at you because they were playing. So we're hesitant. We're just like, I just don't know. This is kind of a little ambiguous here. So sometimes because of ambiguity, you got a lot of people around watching you have an emergency and nobody comes to help you, okay? Because they're really not sure if you're in trouble or not. Some emergencies are clear, some aren't. The second one is this. It's called cohesiveness. And what that means is this, that if there's people in the group that are watching you have an emergency, if they know you or if they are your friend, then there's a greater opportunity that they're actually going to help you, which we appreciate that. We're glad you are our friend and you're going to help because you know who I am. But if you have a lot of strangers, okay, that are there and are watching you have this emergency in your life, the less chance anybody does anything because they're like, hey, I don't know that guy, and so, just kind of tough. And maybe somebody else in the group knows the guy, but I'm going to let them help. And so there's that cohesiveness thing that happens there. If a stranger, and they're not going to help, probably. If they know you, then there's more of a chance that they're going to. The third one is this. It's called diffusion of responsibility. Okay, so if you're the only person there and somebody else is having an emergency, you're going to intuitively, you're going to feel responsible to help them. But if there's 40 of you standing around and somebody's having an emergency, then you're thinking, I'm going to let somebody else handle this, right? I'm going to let somebody else do this. I'm going to let somebody else probably know CPR. Somebody else is probably a doctor in the group. We've all thought that before. Like somebody else is a whole lot more qualified than I am. And so we don't do anything to help somebody because there's this diffusion of responsibility. And so what they found out is this, is that 70% of the people, okay, that if they're alone in an emergency situation, 70% of the people, they'll do something. Like they will actually step out, they'll say something, they'll intervene, they'll talk, they'll do something to help the person who's in trouble. 40%, only 40%, if there's a group of people, only 40% of those groups of people actually stepped out to help somebody. So if you go read the history behind this bystander effect, it's really fascinating stuff. And fascinating, I guess, from a psychological perspective, not if you're the one having the emergency. But there have been people who have had, I'm talking about tragic events happen to them. That everything in the world screams, help me. And nobody did. I mean, nobody stepped up. Nobody stood out. Nobody said, I'll help, I'll call 911. They watched it happen, thinking somebody else was going to do something. Somebody else was going to take care of it. I don't know if it's really an issue or not, but they didn't do anything at all. And it's kind of sad. Now, I know you wouldn't do that. You're much better than that. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Because you're going to step in. You're going to act. Now, I'll give you a common day real example. You guys have probably seen this if you watch TV at all. John Quinones has a show. What would you do? Y'all have watched that before, right? So what would you do? The whole show is really, it's kind of testing the bystander effect. So you've got like this guy and this girl, and they're in a restaurant, and they're arguing, and the guy's getting kind of verbally, abusive towards her, and then he starts threatening her, and she's like cowering down, and just, whatever you say, just don't hit me, and then the camera pans to everybody else in the restaurant, and I mean, everybody else is looking, and they have this shocked look on their face, but nobody's doing anything. And you're sitting in your living room, you're thinking, come on, man, really? I mean, you're going to let this guy do this, and you're not going to say anything? You're not going to do anything? I mean, you're going to let him walk out of here, and he's about to hurt her? And so we just watch this effect, because everybody's like, somebody else is going to do something. Somebody else knows this girl. Somebody else is going to take responsibility for this. I mean, I just don't know that I should, because this is just weird, and we feel awkward about it in those moments like that. And so finally, when somebody in the restaurant, steps up, is like, hey, dude, you should not. This has got to stop. And you don't need to date him anymore. You just like restraining order, go to the judge because there's problems between you two. And you just don't want this stuff to escalate. And so when finally somebody stands up, you're like, hey man, hallelujah, so glad. And we feel the stress. I mean, just watching the show. So here's the thing with God. God has an invitation for you to action. Okay? For you to step in, for you to step out there, for you to do what you know you should do, to not be so embarrassed, to not be, somebody else is going to handle this stuff, to not allow somebody else, but for you to be the one to step in and to take the action, to be a good neighbor. And here's the thing about this story that Jesus tells today, and it's really pretty sad, because it goes against everything that we just talked about with the bystander effect. Because there was this guy in the story, and we're going to read it in just a second, that legitimately he was hurt. There's no question, there's no ambiguity to this. I mean, the guy's been beat up, he's half dead, he's laying on the side of the road. There's no question at all that he needs help. And it wasn't like there was a large group of people standing around, because there wasn't. There was one guy that walks by and he doesn't do anything. There was another guy that walks by and he doesn't do anything. I mean, they're the only person that's there. It's clear that this man needs help. It's clear that they're the only one that can offer help at that moment. And yet they do nothing at all. At least the first two, they do nothing at all. And we read that story, or we watch John Quinones on TV, or we hear about this other stuff, and we're like, how can anybody do that? I mean, how can we see somebody who is in need and do nothing? How can we acknowledge that there's an emergency happening in somebody's life and we don't step in and say anything or act or be a good neighbor to them? And so God tells this story, Jesus does, this parable about really it's this invitation to action. It's an invitation to be involved in the things that God is involved in other people's lives, and to just be merciful, to just be kind to them, to just help them out in some way or another. So I want you guys to look over in Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 28. This is where it starts. It's really not into the meat of the story yet. This is kind of the beginning of the conversation, but it's important. So we're going to look at this. But really, here's the thing. There's a question, there's an answer, and then they're done. And they move on to kind of a second question that really where Jesus kind of hones in on. So here's what it says in verse 25 in Luke chapter 10. It says, "And behold, a lawyer stood up to put Jesus," and that's him, to put Jesus to the test. Now, this wasn't a lawyer like you and I think about lawyers. I mean, it's not corporate law, it's not tax law, not family law. This is God's law. Now, it's kind of strange to us to think about it that way, but God does have law. In the first century especially, there were men who were lawyers of God's law. And so they were there to make sure that everybody kept God's law, and that the people who were teaching God's law were teaching it the right way, and they had the right kind of take on the whole thing. And so that's what this guy was doing, is it looks like he's following Jesus around. He's part of the crowd. He's listening to Jesus, the rabbi, teaching God's law, making sure that Jesus is doing it right. Okay? And so that's why he stands up in this crowd and asks this question of Jesus and tests him. And he says, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law, and how do you read it?" And the lawyer answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and with all of your soul, and with all of your strength, and all of your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You've answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." So, guy asked Jesus, "What do I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus says, "Well, you tell me. How do you read the law?" So the lawyer says, and he quoted it really good, Deuteronomy chapter 6, Leviticus chapter 19, same things that Jesus taught in the Gospels. He said, these are the two greatest commandments. Everything God has said hinges on these two commandments. You got to love God with everything you got, all that you are, all that you ever will be. I mean, that's it. And then you need to love your neighbor as yourself. Everything hinges on those two commandments. But here's the thing. The lawyer couldn't leave it alone. I don't know if you've ever met anybody like that before, where they have to have the last word. You know, they have to say one more thing. They can't just leave the conversation like it is. You know, one more question, one more comment. They're the kind of folks that feel like they have to leave the conversation having won the conversation, having one up the other person. Jesus is typically not the person you want to try that on, but he tries anyway. Okay? So he asked this question. So who's my neighbor? I know who God is. I know I'm supposed to love him. And I know I'm supposed to love my neighbor. But you tell me who my neighbor is. So Jesus says this. Or it says this next. But he, the lawyer, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho." Jericho's lower than Jerusalem, so it's a downhill run. "And he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by the other side." I mean, legitimate, conscientious effort to go around this man. So he goes off on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, another religious leader, when he came to the place and saw him, pass by on the other side. But a Samaritan, somebody you wouldn't kind of think of right now, as he journeyed, came to where this man was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. And he went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him. And whatever more you spend, I'll repay it when I come back." And then Jesus asked a question. He says this, "Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers?" And the lawyer said, and he couldn't bring himself to say the Samaritan, so he says, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus says, "I want you to go and to do likewise." So here's the thing. The guy wanted to know, who's my neighbor? You know, tell me who it is that I got to do good to, because he wanted some balance. It's like, I can do good to these, but not to those. I can pay attention to this one, but not to that one. And really the question wasn't so much who your neighbor is, because that's easy, and I won't tell you. It's whoever's around you. It's the guy you're married to, the woman you said I do to, it's the children that you've had, the family that you've got, it's the people that you work with, the folks that we're in church with, whoever's life path you cross, that's your neighbor. I mean, it's not a proximity thing, it's a human nature or human mankind type of thing. And so that's who your neighbor is. And so it's not so much who is my neighbor, but Jesus reframes it and refocuses the conversation to this, to be a neighbor. That's the point. That's what Jesus is trying to get across to us. That's his invitation to action. Be a neighbor to the people who are around you. Be nice, be kind, give mercy out to them. And so the bystander effect, it just it blows up here in this story. Because there's no ambiguity. This guy's clearly been hurt. There is cohesiveness in the sense that this guy was probably a Jew, as was the Levite and the priest. There's no diffusion of responsibility because they're the only ones that are walking past this guy. So there's no plausible there's no plausible explanation for these guys just ignoring this man sitting on the side of the road. You know, they should have been the ones to help, and yet they didn't do it. And we know it's right to do good, right? I mean, to love our God and to love our neighbor, to be a neighbor to our wives and to our husbands and to our children and to the people that we work with. I mean, we get it. That we know we're supposed to do that. And yet we don't do it. I mean, we get on Facebook and you guys write, and other people write ugly stuff about other people. And I know maybe they made you mad and they did you wrong and they sinned against you. And we pull out pen and paper and do it the old style way, and we write it out to them, or we send them a text or an email, or we talk about them behind somebody else's back. I mean, why do we do those things? I mean, because really what we're doing is we're not understanding what God's call for us to action is, and that is to be a neighbor. And then what we do is when we're called on that, when we get found out about, like the bad behavior part, is that we try to justify our actions. We try to do what this lawyer did. He wanted to justify himself. And so we try to justify our inaction, what the good that we should have done that we didn't do. Or we try to justify our bad behavior towards other people. And guys, listen, we fall into this same trap. And it is a trap. And it's one that you've got to be careful about. Because, and here's the question. Do you understand what justification is, or self-justification? Basically, it all boils down to this, that you're making an excuse for yourself. That you're trying to provide some rationale, some defense, some excuse for, bad behavior or inaction on your part. And so you people have said this before, and you've heard it. I was drunk. Or I was under the influence. Or I was on my meds. Or I was off my meds. Or I got so angry because you made me angry that I said these things to you. Or you didn't pay any attention to me, and so this is what I did in retaliation to you. And so we have all of these excuses. We have all of these reasons. We have all of these defensive mechanisms to try and to defend what we've done or what we've not done and the things that we've left undone. We blame the church, right? People say, oh, well, there's hypocrites in the church. Guess what? I know. I mean, it's not a big secret. All of us, to every single one of us, to some degree, have said one thing and done something else. But let me ask you that, is this an excuse for you to not do what is right? I mean, is the bad behavior or the poor behavior or the hypocrisy of somebody else who calls themselves a Christian, I mean, is that an excuse for you to not do what God has called you to do? No, it's not. They're going to answer for themselves. You're going to answer for you. That's not an excuse for you not to do what you know you ought to be doing. And so we blame the church. Sometimes we blame our past. We're like, well, that's how I was raised, and that's what my mama taught me, and that's what my daddy did, and this is what my brother, and my sister, and my aunts and uncles, and we blame the past. But it's the same logic there. I mean, can I blame the way that I was raised? Can I blame my family? Can I blame my dad for my bad behavior today? No, I can't. I can't excuse myself. I can't justify myself based on something my dad did 20 years ago. It doesn't work that way. It's not going to work that way before God. Sometimes we blame just other people. It's not just the situations of the past, but it's just, my mom or my dad or my sister or my brother or my wife or my mom or my kids. I mean, they're the ones, they did this to me. They created this anger in me. And I'm not saying that the hurt and the pain and the problems that we've had because of other people aren't legitimate, but I'm just saying that we're responsible for our behavior. You're an adult. And so we're going to stand before God and answer for us. They'll answer for them. And so we can't excuse our inaction. We can't excuse the fact that we haven't been a neighbor to other people because of what others have done to us. And then people blame God. They're like, hey, God's sovereign. He's the man in the sky, and He has control over all these things. And so it's got to be His fault. It can't be my fault. But here's the thing. You will never be able to justify yourself. You can't do it in your own marriage. You're like, your wife tells you, quit blaming everybody else. It's your fault. Or your husband tells you, quit blaming the kids because this is about you. This isn't about them. And so people struggle. I mean, we cannot justify ourselves. We can't defend ourselves. There is no excuse that you might come up with in your life to excuse your inaction to be a good neighbor or bad behavior. Now here's some good theology, though, for you, because there is one who can excuse us. And there is one who can justify us. It's just not you. This is what Romans chapter 3 says in verse 23. It says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by His grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by His blood to be received by faith. And so listen, I can't justify myself. There are no excuses. There are no rationales. There are no defenses for me. It's my behavior. I did it. I said it. I thought it. I was that. Same thing with you. I can't justify myself, but God can, and He does when you come to faith through Jesus. He's the only one who can excuse you by His blood shed on the cross. Very important for us to remember that. And so the lawyer tried to justify himself. We try to justify ourselves. And so Jesus tells him this parable about the Levite that, goes around the guy who's naked and half dead and beat to death. The priest does the same thing. And yet here's this Samaritan who stops and says, you know what? I need to do what's right. And he gets the guy and he pours oil and wine on his wounds that cleanse it like an antiseptic. He bandages him up. He puts him on his donkey. He takes him to the inn. He pays his 2 denarii to the innkeeper and says, hey man, help this guy out. Take care of him. Do whatever needs to be done. If you spend more money, I'll come back and I'll pay you that too. Let's just do what's right by this guy. And so he proved to be a neighbor. God's calling you to this invitation to action to simply be a neighbor to the people that you live with and the people that you know and the folks that you work with. Listen to what Jesus says at the end of this in verse 37. It says, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? Again, it's not who is my neighbor. It's about you being a neighbor to somebody else. And he says, the one who showed him mercy. And then Jesus says, you go and you do likewise. You just do what that guy did. Because he did what was right. Go and show mercy when mercy is needed. Offer forgiveness when forgiveness is needed. Pray for people and care for people and love people. Write them notes, send them flowers. When you'd rather care less, and instead care for them. When you'd rather not talk, sit down and listen to what they have to say. Just be a neighbor to them and love them and care for them. You know, the Bible says, and you've heard this before, that faith without works it's dead, it's lifeless, it's just something's just really, really wrong when we're not living out our faith. So faith with works is alive, right? It's healthy, it's well. And so that's the works. Jesus says you go and do likewise. Salvation is by faith in the one who gave His life on the cross for you. But the rest of life is lived out in a way that your faith has action and that it does. And that the way Jesus explained it was this, is be a great neighbor to the people who are around you. So here's what I want you to do, just kind of your challenge for the week. I want you to think about the people that you're married to, the folks that you're dating, kids that you've got, the family that's out there, the people that you work with, the folks that you're here in church with. And I want you to pick out one person this week that needs it, okay? And be a great neighbor to them. I mean, just go and do likewise. Act on what you say you believe to be true. Let's pray.